Hi, I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I am here to do another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads. Today, I'm going to be talking about The Paleontologist by Luc Dumas, which I read recently and I thought was pretty good. So this one, I haven't read anything else by Luc Dumas. I guess I assume that's how he would like his name pronounced. Obviously, it's spelled like um, Alexandre Dumas, but anyway, um, Paleontologist is the only one of his that I've read. I know on the Goodreads reviews, there are a bunch of people talking about another book, and it looks like a History of Fear. Um, so I will probably end up reading that one as well because I thought this one was pretty good. The Paleontologist is a story that is kind of an interesting blend of horror elements, I guess. There's a sort of haunted house quality, I guess, except that the haunted house is a natural history museum, which is kind of an interesting twist. And there's a fair bit of the kind of classic horror blend of sort of supernatural or semi-supernatural elements alongside the decidedly non-supernatural elements of horror. There's in a sense there are sort of several antagonists or antagonistic forces in this particular story, and some of them are totally supernatural or are imbued with that type of flavor, and some of them are very much not, are the sort of banal horrors that exist in the real world. Um, and like a lot of horror stories, this one really, as much as the events of the story present all of these, there are a number of supernatural things that happen in the story, but the real, for lack of a better term, it's not even really subtext because there is a lot of it talked about pretty directly in the text, that much of what this horror story is about is really trauma and attempting to heal from all of the nasty things that have happened in the past of especially our main character, Dr. Simon Neely, who's a fun main character. He is a paleontologist. He has been working at the Field Museum in Chicago, had a very troubled past growing up as a kid, and has come back and is now working in the Natural History Museum that is basically on the outskirts of or right near his old hometown in kind of small town Pennsylvania. I think Wrexham is the name of the town. Um, After many years and after having kind of struggled with all of the things that have happened, and also set really deliberately in the midst of the COVID pandemic, or in the midst of COVID lockdown, I guess I should say, which I thought was neat. It's a clever. There's a number of clever things about this story, but one of the clever things that I liked was this idea of the transformation of the Natural History Museum into the spooky haunted house as being related to lockdown, and the idea of, well, there's nobody in the museum, and so it's spooky to be in there with almost nobody there. It's basically just him and a couple of other people all in other parts of the building normally. And because the paleontology lab is down in the basement, there's no cell service most of the time, and the Wi-Fi is really bad, and all of the kind of classic elements of disconnect from the outside world that are really a traditional part of horror structures being done in a modern way, and it's neat to see all that sort of stuff. um, the actual paleontology in here, a I'm not a paleontologist by any means. I'm not an expert on the field, although I did, when I was like six, really think I was going to go on to be a paleontologist. So you know how that goes. But a lot of the kind of texture of the story has this really interesting um, flavor of scientific reality. There's a fair bit of stuff about actual dinosaurs, about things like fossil formations, and research into the actual like mechanical elements of paleontology, the idea of like finding a fossil and trying to remove the rock that is the fossil out of the rock that is around the fossil that is not fossil, but it's all a very similar makeup. It's not um, quite exactly the same material makeup, because basically all of the non-organic stuff in the bones that doesn't decay stays in the fossil, but the fossil is really more like rock in the shape of a bone. In the case of the sort of traditional bone fossils, there's also a discussion of trace fossils, which is basically like the imprint of an animal's skin or of a feather or something like that. All of the little, or footprints are a classic one. There's actually a um, we are lucky enough here in Central Texas to have a couple of pretty cool museums with some pretty cool fossil stuff. And this whole part of the world was basically a shallow sea during the early Cretaceous period. And so it's all limestone here. Um, and there's a lot of fossilized stuff that has been captured in that limestone. And so we have a number of fossils from that, which is pretty cool. Anyway, um, book as a whole, like I said, so we have Dr. Simon Neely, and then we have a whole cast of characters, a kind of constellation of different figures around him. Some of the characters from his past that, in a couple of cases, make appearances in the present day as he sort of works through all of the things that have gone on in his life, and then a number of, especially other employees of the museum who are all kind of interesting and have their own thing going on and all of that sort of stuff. One of the major characters in the story is an old woman who is a very major donor to the museum, and turns out to have a connection to some of the stuff going on and all of that. Um, anyway, there is, I think, arguably the weakest element of this particular story is the way that for lack of a better term, the kind of horror structure of the story becomes, in particular, really obvious in hindsight. I think in when actively reading through it, it is not as obvious, and it doesn't by any means make it impossible to enjoy the book at all. It is just really obvious in hindsight the way that the first half of the book, which is also, I think, the better half of the book, involves building up this whole collection of secondary characters alongside Dr. Neely, and then the um, the second half of the book, which is probably not as good. In particular, I mean, it's one of the classic issues of a haunted house story, that as you learn more about the haunting elements, that there's often less room for kind of weird atmospheric strangeness. But anyway, as we get on in the story in the second half, a lot of the kind of structure of the story involves um, trimming down that collection of secondary characters as part of stripping away all of the various allies that Simon might be able to call upon or have a connection to the outside world with, or anything like that. And in particular, kind of fairly late in the story, there's periods where a lot more material is basically summarized, a kind of larger period of time, that it reflects the characters, especially Dr. Simon's particular disconnection from all of the other concerns of the world, but it's still a little bit I guess in some ways it feels a little less satisfying to read than especially some of the early parts that have a great kind of freaky deaky feel to them and all that sort of stuff. At the same time, it's still a story that is, about ghosts and including dinosaur ghosts, basically, which is awesome. It's super kind of fun and interesting. Probably one of I after talking about how the second half of the story is not as good, I will say one of the strongest elements of the story is that there is a real, I think it's we describe it as a very honest treatment of everything that the characters have gone through as the sort of closing of the story. That like a lot of horror stories, like I said, this is one that is as much about character trauma as it is about haunting stuff that is much more kind of visibly present. And I think the story, the book as a whole, kind of in concluding it, there's a clever way that it's able to deal with all of the various different plot threads that have been going on in the whole story without it feeling like a kind of unearned ending that doesn't reflect the difficulties that the characters have gone through and all of that sort of stuff. So I will say that that was a really fun element of it. Anyway, so yeah, I don't know if there's a whole lot more to say about it without getting into spoilers. I've been trying not to spoil too much. I mean, I think if you read basically anything of the summary from the blurb, you will get about as much kind of spoiler content as I've had here, talking about it's a story about trauma and there's dinosaur ghosts, and that's sort of the core that you are likely to, hopefully that is enough to convince anyone who might be interested to be like, oh, that sounds like fun. So yeah, it's like I said, I think it's a pretty fun horror story. It's I'm trying to be realistic about the fact that I didn't think it was like the best horror thing I've ever read. But I also did certainly enjoy it plenty too. I don't know if I would read it again, but I'll definitely read one of the other books that Luc has written, Luc Dumas. So yeah, it was good. It was fun. I would encourage you to check it out. It's not very long. It's 300 and something pages, if I remember. And pretty easy read. Makes clever use of kind of some contemporary elements. Like I said, the whole use of lockdown for the haunted house I thought was pretty clever. Especially, I mean, to be honest, I'm someone who doesn't often read that many recently published things. I just don't kind of keep up with that well. So it was neat to see that in a story like this. So anyway, yeah, if that sounds interesting to you, all of this stuff about a weird natural history haunted house, I would totally recommend checking this one out because it is fun and worth checking out. So yeah, the Paleontologist, Luc Dumas, like I said, 300 and something pages, and a pretty fun read. And you might even learn something with the discussion of, the various fossil formations in parts of Colorado and Wyoming and things like that. And there's a lot of discussion about some of kind of the politics of natural history museums. That is a interesting element of this story as well. And as you might imagine, that's also a place where banal horror ends up at times arising. But I don't want to say too much more about that because that sort of leads into a lot of what the kind of actual story of the book is about. So anyway, I will leave you with that. I'm not sure how often I'm going to keep doing these. I'm trying to do a Pellam's Wasteland reads basically once every week or two. Planning on putting these out probably on Fridays like I have been. I guess it'll depend on if I end up doing these a little faster at some point. If I do more than one every 2 weeks or so, then I will probably switch up the release schedule a little bit at some point. But otherwise, I have been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. So yeah, read the Paleontologist and all that, and hope you enjoy.